in this lecture, what I want to do is introduce you to some key issues, some key messages, and to whet your appetite for the application of epidemiology to an emerging field, which is called research on harm to others. So let's get started. Alcohol and drug effects can be studied and have been studied for the most part in terms of the harm to the user. And you've already experienced, I think, in your readings, a pretty good exposure to what those types of harms are. But there's a whole other range of harms that are often not studied and have now become the subject of intense scrutiny because of the tremendous effects, the cascading effects that substance use and substance use disorders have within a society. And that's called harm to others. So it's not just that people affect their own lives, their own health. They affect the lives and the health of others in their environment, and often many strangers at the same time. To study alcohol and drug effects in order to understand where they're coming from and how to prevent them, we need to look at both short-term effects and long-term effects. And these can be quite different, and in your readings, you'll be exposed to different ways of characterizing the short-term and the long-term effects. And these effects occur at the physiological level, at the psychological level, and at the social level. So in order to understand alcohol and drug effects, we've got to take into account who experiences the harm, whether the effects are short-term or long-term, and what types of effects they are. In your readings, you've been exposed to a epidemiological characterization of the mechanisms of harm. And I'm not going to repeat that here, but to remind you what we have learned from years of research, that these mechanisms can be described in three broad terms: the effects of intoxication, the toxic effects of a substance on different organ systems, and the ability of many of these psychoactive substances to produce alcohol and drug dependence. Each mechanism is different, and each is associated with a different type of problem. There was a truism in medicine that suggested that if you knew alcoholism, you knew medicine, because alcohol affects every organ system in the body. There's another truism that I think applies just as well to public health, which is if you know substance use disorders, you know public health, because alcohol and drug problems are pervasive. And if you can understand how those problems develop, then you can really learn how to use public health to improve the health of the population. In addition to what you're studying in the chapters on mechanisms of harm, I want to draw your attention to the complicated explanation of how the type of substance, the dose of the substance, the pattern of use, and the mode of administration all work to produce a variety of different harms. But in particular, this graphic, which is illustrated in one of your readings, has in the lower right-hand corner a box that is devoted to the social implications and social reactions of substance use. And even though it forms a small part of this particular explanatory model, it plays an enormous role. And I'd like to stimulate your thinking about why this is so important. When a drug is illegal, it leads to changes in the consequences of use. It leads to changes in the way the drug is perceived by society. It leads to changes even in the way that the drug is used and administered. So psychoactive substances, particularly substances with high dependence potential, like the opioids, are highly stigmatized because they're illegal, not because of their intrinsic properties. Indeed, if they're used in a medical setting, there's no stigma involved. So the fact that certain patterns of use, IV drug use in particular, certain types of opioid substances like heroin are illegal means they're stigmatized, and it forces the use to become played out in a much different way than if it were legal. And the contribution of illegality to the pattern of problems that are experienced by individuals and within society has been quite dramatic, including the precipitation of a war on drugs, which has all kinds of other consequences which often have not been taken into account. So I would encourage you to think about how the legality or the illegality of a substance affects the consequences that are experienced by the user and how society reacts to the use of that substance. The second thing I want to draw your attention to is this whole emerging area of harm to others. This comes from an initiative by the World Health Organization to take into account, using epidemiological methods, the fact that psychoactive substances do damage that goes far beyond the individual. And up until recently, this type of damage has not been really studied systematically. So one of the priorities of the World Health Organization in their global strategy to deal with the harmful effects of alcohol is to collect data at a population level around the world, which helps us to understand what types of consequences alcohol use in particular has when it is affecting other people. And this same technology eventually is going to be applied to drugs as well. The first major study that was conducted was started about 5 years ago by the World Health Organization in 9 countries, including Australia, New Zealand, India, Laos, Nigeria, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Chile, and Vietnam. The Harm to Others projects brings together teams of investigators in these countries who prepare population surveys. The group comes together, they design a survey, much like you've been asked to do, and they use standardized measures. In this particular case, there was very little research that could serve as a precedent for this study, and they had to construct new scales to measure different types of harm that are experienced by other people in the drinker's environment. So in addition to looking at the different types of harm that people reported, they were interested in things like the distribution of these harms according to socioeconomic characteristics and subjective well-being and the health of people who are affected by other people who are using substances. Here's a way of looking at harm to others in terms of a vicious cycle of the effect that substance use has on individuals around a drinker or a drug user. If you take an individual drinker, they might experience social problems, they might experience health problems, medical problems, psychiatric disorders, and a variety of other issues. In experiencing these problems, they're also affecting other people in the work setting. They're affecting productivity. They're affecting their relationship with their supervisors. They're exacting economic costs on a family. And when you extend this to other types of addictive behaviors like gambling, the estimate has been that for every individual gambler who has a problem, there are 10 to 15 more people who are affected by that person. So the effect tends to be multiplied, starting with the work setting. Secondly, the effects are especially felt by friends and the people close to the drinker. So people in the peer group initially may have a lot of fun in a drinking group, but also when drinking gets out of hand, they're affected by other people's behavior. If they're non-drinkers, then they're affected by the drinker's behavior as well, just being close to them. A major source of problems to others is the effect that a drinker's behavior has in the family situation. It affects the relationship between partners in a marital situation. It affects the roles that people play as parents in taking care of their kids. And we've had ample evidence that within a family situation, the effects are generational and multi-generational. So a parent's heavy drinking is going to affect their marriage, and it's going to affect the psychiatric and psychological development of their children. Finally, drinking and other substance use affect people who are not known to that particular drinker. The most common example is traffic fatalities, where often a drunk driver will be responsible not only for creating injuries to people who are traveling with them in an automobile who they know, but also injuries and fatalities to people who are complete strangers. Here's an example of data coming from the Harm to Others project from different countries. And looking at the prevalence rates of harm to individuals, we can now add to that the harm that the drinker's behavior causes in a wide variety of different life areas within society. So these are responses in a population survey to a standardized set of questions with fixed response categories that ask people in the drinker's environment what types of problems they've experienced in relation to other people's drinking. And what has been reported in a country like Chile, which is not unlike many other countries, is the following. 4% of the adult population reports that they have had traffic accidents connected with people who drink and drive. 5% have reported that they've had some contact with police as a function of somebody else's drinking. This could be filing a complaint or being subject to an assault or in other ways being affected by a drinker's behavior. Violence, particularly physical violence, is reported by 5% as being attributable to somebody else's drinking. Family problems by 12%. Friends' relationship is being damaged is reported by 9%. Fear of the intoxicated behavior of a drinker is reported by 18%, and verbal maltreatment by 21%. So here we have a cascading effect where an individual drinker who's consuming excessively is likely to affect the lives of many people beyond themselves. Other findings emerging from this project are that respondents believe that the effects of alcohol consumption are relatively neutral when they look at it. They don't look at it necessarily favorably or unfavorably. They just say that in most occasions, people, when they drink, have no major positive or negative effect on them. And in a population survey, about 50% of the people report that. But what's interesting is that 1/3 report that the effects are negative. And a much lower proportion, in Chile, for example, 10% report that the effects are positive. What this suggests is that in the general population, alcohol may have a net negative effect on people's lives. Either it's neutral, but it's certainly not favorable for everybody. Another thing is that we find big differences in harm to others according to gender, education, and socioeconomic level, with males experiencing more problems from the drinker than females, although women certainly experience violence, particularly domestic violence. And people of higher education level experiencing fewer harms from drinkers than people at lower socioeconomic levels. So to summarize, the key messages that we want to get across for your readings and your exercises dealing with the consequences and harms that come from alcohol and drugs are the following. Harm derives from different mechanisms, including toxic effects of the substance, the pattern and the volume of use, and the mode of administration, including dosage. The characteristics of the user and the social context play an important role in the type of harm that an individual experiences. And the harms are not just experienced by the substance user, but family, friends, work colleagues, and strangers are also affected. And epidemiology is a tool that can help us to understand not only the mechanisms of these harms, but hopefully can suggest where and how interventions can be applied.